Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. There you go. I'm Kris. This was not requested, but I did a video of one of my other old presidents. And so I'm covering this one. This is James K. Polk, the greatest American president you've never heard of. I have been to the ancestral home. Since there's no James K. Polk home around his home that he lived at after his presidency. He didn't live very long, 4 or 5 months maybe. Then he died. He was buried there. The house burned down, and he was relocated to, hey, stop. He was relocated to Nashville at the capital area, downtown area somewhere. And the ancestral home is in Columbia, Tennessee, which is where his family, they created that town. And the home I visited was his father's home, which he lived not too far, like a couple blocks away. But the father's home is where he had more of the guests and dinner parties and stuff like that. That wasn't the home that burned down. That was a different home. That home burned down or was demolished as well. So there isn't any itself. But if you visit the home, you'll see all James K. Polk's stuff in the home. Some of the father's stuff here and there, but it's pretty much his stuff. It's very fascinating. It's a really good tour. But they're pushing to have his body moved and buried on that property because he wanted to be buried at a Polk residence. So they're pushing. It's been gaining momentum for about 7 or 8 years now. I visited in 19 and they were talking about it. They're still talking about it. Nashville wants him. And the ancestral home wants him. Oh my goodness, hold on. There's not a whole lot of space at the ancestral home because he's literally, the home is in a neighborhood. So there's a little area in the backyard, but there's not a whole lot of space there. It's very confined. But anyways, before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, completely free, helps me out a lot. You can also donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you request a video after you donate, you sponsor that video. It's just my way of saying thank you. You can still request without donating. It just takes a little more time and you don't get that extra little shout out. Okay. We will do this all in one video. I know 25-minute part, but I'll get past the 30 seconds. Plus I think there's an ad at the beginning, so we'll get into it.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools, and run it. Quick question. How often have you seen a new president enter office with a sack full of promises only to immediately break the entire lot of them? Well, that number probably corresponds to the number of presidents you've lived under. From George H.W. Bush's no new taxes to Obama failing to close Gitmo, the White House has a long tradition of overpromising and under-delivering. Yet there was one president who bucked this trend, a man who, on entering office, promised 4 specific things, achieved them all, and then left after a single term. That man was James K. Polk, and he was arguably the most successful president in US history. At the moment Polk was inaugurated in 1845, a movement was underway to increase America's territory. Declaring that it expands the nation westward, Polk quickly took the US from a nation of 1.7 million square miles to nearly 3 million. It was Polk who brought in Texas, California, Oregon Territory. Polk who ordered the US to stretch from sea to shining sea. But all this giddy expansion came at a price. Polk may have left the US greatly enlarged, but he also left it standing on the brink of catastrophe. The life James Knox Polk was born into on November 2nd, 1795.
Okay, sorry about that. Had to go get something. All right, back to the video.
Was one for which only the term hardy could suffice. Born in a log cabin in rural North Carolina, Polk was the first of an incredible 10 children, all of whom his mother would raise in a strict Calvinist faith. That meant little fun and a lot of hard work. As an adult, Polk would overwork to the point of exhaustion, unable to escape the feeling that rest was somehow wicked. Yet, compared to the rest of his childhood, work was almost a respite. When the boy was 10, his family upped sticks and moved to the Tennessee frontier, where his father was determined to carve out a plantation. For over 500 miles, the family traveled on rough roads via wagons, subjecting themselves to all sorts of deprivations. It was on this journey that the future president began to suffer the ill health that would plague him for his life. And given how bad things got, actual plague would have probably been preferable. As a teen, for example, Polk was forced to undergo surgery for his illness. With no anesthetic and no antibiotics, the surgeon simply gave him some brandy and then sliced his urinary tract open and sewed him back up, all while the boy presumably screamed. Still, the
Sorry again.
move to Tennessee did at least change the family's fortunes. The new plantation grew to thousands of acres, tended by 50 slaves. As the Polks came up in the world, they began to rub shoulders with the great and good of the state, the greatest of whom was no doubt Andrew Jackson. A living military legend, Old Hickory was already famous for his controversial wars and role in Tennessee's expansion. He was also about to become the biggest, most divisive thing in American politics. In other words, exactly the sort of personality an ambitious young man might want to hitch themselves to. A young man like James Polk. It's uncertain exactly when Polk and Jackson first met, but it can't have been long after the young man returned from university in North Carolina. Initially settling in Nashville to practice law, Polk quickly set his sights on politics, picking up a side gig clerking in the state Senate. It was here that he fell decisively into the orbit of Democratic Republicans, likely the single most powerful party in U.S. history. By 1823, the Democratic Republican Party was headed towards its 7th election victory in a row, a feat still unmatched in American politics. But as the party reached a quarter century in power, the lack of opposition had become a curse. Fissures were starting to erupt that threatened to engulf everything. It would be from the ashes of these political wildfires that Polk's Washington career was born. For now, the future president concentrated on local politics, winning election to Tennessee's state House of Representatives. There he made perhaps the shrewdest decision of his life. Tennessee was in need of a new senator to send to Washington. Although he was aligned with a different faction, Polk wound up casting his vote for a grateful Andrew Jackson. It seems the young man was already able to read the political winds. Within a year, those winds had become an oncoming storm. In 1824, 4 different candidates claimed the mantle of Democratic-Republican nominee. Among them was Andrew Jackson. Down in Tennessee, Polk campaigned ferociously for his new friend, delighting when he gained the largest share of the popular vote. But since none of the 4 managed to win outright, it fell to Congress to pick the next president. To Polk and Jackson's outrage, they went with second-place finisher John Quincy Adams. Yet the result would be a blessing in disguise. When the next election rolled around, Old Hickory would be able to use outrage generated by Adams's corrupt win to propel himself to the very top, and his new protege would be riding along right beside him. The same year he lost the presidency by a whisker, Andrew Jackson gave Polk perhaps the best piece of advice the young man would ever receive: to get married. See, the thing we haven't mentioned is that James Polk was a dude who was incredibly hard to like. Austere, dour, prone to overwork, awful at conversation, and uninterested in anything but politics, Polk was like your nightmare Tinder date, a sexless, boring man who couldn't charm his way out of a paper bag. Which is why his 1824 marriage to Sarah Childress was such a gift. The rich daughter of politically connected slave owners, Sarah was a born socialite, the sort of woman who could work a room so well that everyone would leave wanting to do exactly as she had suggested. As Polk's wife, Sarah used every ounce of this charm to help nurture and expand her husband's Tennessee power base. In no time at all, that base was flourishing. In 1825, Polk abandoned the state legislature, taking a run at the House of Representatives. He won handily, the first of 7 terms that he'd serve in Washington, and that gave him a ringside seat to the biggest electoral storm in decades. The 1828 election saw Jackson's comeback, netting the victory denied 4 years earlier. At the head of the newly created Democratic Party, he crushed John Quincy Adams, taking 55% of the popular vote. Inaugurated the following March, Jackson entered the White House like a hurricane, ready to smash the old order to pieces. Personally, James K. Polk couldn't wait. Rather than just being Jackson's ally in the House, Polk became the 7th president's lieutenant, the guy who'd go to bat for him no matter what batshit crazy thing Jackson was slinging. Every single idea that Jackson put forward, Polk defended to the hilt, helping whip his fellow representatives into following the president. His colleagues made fun of him, calling him Young Hickory, made out that he was Jackson's puppet, but Polk was more than that. It may have been ambition that initially hitched him to this brash populist, but it was something else that made him stay. For Polk, Jacksonian democracy wasn't just an idea, it was a movement that actively expanded the electorate, that spoke for the people. And the people couldn't get enough of it. Re-elected in 1832, Jackson was by now starting to consider Polk the son that he'd never had. He backed his protege to become Speaker of the House before ensuring that Polk would keep that position even after he stepped down as president, a promise made easy when his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, won in 1836. For Polk, this was an era where he rode the zeitgeist. It's the crest of a popular wave that looked set to keep rolling for eternity. Or so it must have seemed. In truth, Jackson's policies, especially regarding banking, had set the economy on a crash course, and his divisive manner had sparked a massive backlash in his home state. In 1835 and 1837, anti-Jackson politicians won the Tennessee governor's mansion. In 1836, the state voted against Van Buren. Worried about the rebellion in his backyard, Polk quit the House, returned home, and in 1839 ran for governor on an openly Jacksonian platform. His shock win was supposed to turn the tide, to show this wave was never going to stop sweeping the nation. Instead, Polk's victory turned out to be a mere breather before the wave dumped him naked, shivering, and broken onto reality's stony shore. By 1840, the Jackson experiment had failed, the economy was being hammered, people were going bankrupt, and life tasted of ash and bitterness. That same year, the Whig Party under William Henry Harrison beat the Democrats at the polls. Just 12 months later, Polk was booted from the Tennessee governor's mansion. When he tried to retake it in 1843, he failed spectacularly. With Jackson's movement floundering and the Whigs in ascendance, Polk suddenly found himself cast adrift. He returned to the family plantation, wondering if maybe that was it, if his time at the top had already come and gone. He needn't have worried. In 12 months, the Whigs' seemingly unstoppable rise was going to splutter and stall. Then when it did, it would be Young Hickory who'd be ready to replace them. Now, just before we get into the rest of today's video, I do want to say that this one is brought to you by Squarespace. This some or affair is whatever you want it to be look like. If so, very cool. Something that the code fresh and colors. Patron 24/7project.com for a free trial. You'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. At this stage, you might be wondering how the hell Polk is going to transition from moping around in Tennessee to leading the United States in a single year. And the answer can be summed up with one word: Texas. 7 years earlier, Texas had seceded from Mexico, establishing an independent republic. Not that the US wanted it to remain independent, though. This was the era of manifest destiny, a term coined in 1845 that expressed Americans' desire to expand westward, starting with the annexation of Texas. The problem was, Mexico still wanted their wayward province back, so rather than risk war, Washington quietly avoided the issue. But then John Tyler came along and screwed everything up. The 10th president, Tyler had taken over from William Henry Harrison after the latter died in office. Nominally a Whig, Tyler was such an un-Whig-like president that his party hated him. Knowing he'd never get renominated in 1844, Tyler began desperately casting about for a popular issue to boost his run as an independent. And nothing was more popular than wanting to annex Texas. Tyler's pro-annexation stance effectively turned the Democratic Party on its head. Beforehand, Martin Van Buren had been expected to run again, but Tyler's announcement made Texas such a hot issue that Van Buren had to weigh in. And that was a problem, because while Van Buren would lose Southern Democrats if he came out as anti-annexation, he'd lose his home state of New York if he came out as pro. Slavery, you see, was still legal in Texas. If Texas was admitted to the Union, the delicate balance between slave and free states would be destroyed. Van Buren's one slim hope was to oppose annexation, then hope Southern Democrats, after a whole whole lot of moaning, would rally behind him rather than let the Whigs win the election. Sadly, he misjudged how willing Southerners were to play nice with him. At the 1844 Democratic Convention, the ballot deadlocked. There was no majority for anti-annexation Van Buren, but his rival, Lewis Cass, couldn't quite win either. On the 8th ballot, someone suggested throwing in a compromise candidate to break the tie. Someone known for his party loyalty. Someone who might be, I don't know, chilling down in Tennessee right now, only dimly aware of all of this drama. The moment Polk's name was added, Van Buren knew that the game was over. Rather than let Cass become eventual victor, he threw all of his supporters behind the new guy. At 2 p.m. on May the 30th, 1844, Polk became the Democratic nominee. It would take word nearly a week to reach Tennessee. It reached Washington that same day, though, thanks to a newly installed telegraph. And the dudes in Washington found the whole thing hilarious. Polk was such a nobody that newspapers declared, "Who is James K. Polk?" The Whigs responded by putting up their best man, Henry Clay, knowing it to be a cakewalk. Sadly for Clay, it turns out the answer to who was James K. Polk was one clever son of a bitch. Polk's genius was to embrace Texas annexation while also throwing Northerners a bone. What if Oregon Territory, then jointly administered with Britain, also joined the Union? Since any new Oregon state would probably be free, the delicate balance in Congress.
Henry Clay was one of those people, and I've said it before, was one of those people who could have been a good president. And the people at the time really thought highly of him. He was always a guy that was, you know, I think I'm going to vote for Clay. I mean, he deserves it. He's been around. We know his policies. He's a good guy. We like him. He's honest. And then the election comes around, maybe later that year or 2 years or whatever, and you got a couple of candidates there, and you're like, oh, I really like that guy. Man, he came out of nowhere, didn't he? Well, what about Clay? You know what? I'm going to go with this guy, but next time, I'm going with Clay. And that's pretty much how Clay's whole presidential candidacies ran. It was always, oh, this other guy's really good, though. Came out of nowhere. I'm feeling him right now. And, you know, but Clay, you know, hey, look, it's Clay had his chance, but I'm feeling this guy now. So the next time around, if Clay's going to run, I'll vote for him. Next time around, what happens? I think I'm gonna vote for Clay. Yeah. And then come around election time, you know, I really would vote for Clay, but going against this guy, I think this guy just has it. And that's pretty much how Clay's whole thing went. He got into office in the cabinet of William Henry Harrison. Tried to, I don't want to say bully, but tried to dictate the course after Harrison died to John Tyler as to, we're all going to fill in for the president and you just stay vice president. And he was like, no. You know, and he said something, John Tyler said something to the effect of, Harrison and I were elected, you were selected. So I'm going to be the president. You can fill in as my cabinet. I'll keep all of you. But if you don't want to be here, I'll accept your resignation. And so they thought, okay, you know what? Fine, we'll give him this. We'll give him this, whatever. And they thought we're gonna push really strong pro-Whig agendas through. And they found out Tyler said no. He was the president of everyone, not just the president of the Whigs. And so he fought back. That's why his party ousted him, because he refused to do that. Andrew Jackson starts seeing all this happening and starts writing him letters and getting into his head saying, hey, look, your party doesn't want you. The Democrats will work with you. We can push pro-Whig, pro-Democrat agenda. We don't have a problem with that. And so that's what they did. They would write pro-Democrat agenda and then throw in some Whig stuff to try to appease everybody. And as long as Tyler felt that if the Whigs gain something, Democrats gain something. If Whigs lose something, Democrats lose something. He thought if it's all fair, one bill is pro something and negative something, but the next bill is pro this and then negative this. He thought everything is going to be fair. And if it's fair, I'll work with it. And that's what he did. And it's not how politics are anymore. It's always like pro my party, screw your party, pro my party. And John Tyler started feeling like, hey, look, these Democrats really like me. And so he threw out, maybe I run again, but I run as a Democrat. And Andrew Jackson, I don't want to say played him perfectly because that's not fair to Tyler. But Jackson pretty much said, no, Democrats won't vote for you. They won't nominate you. You're a Whig. You went against your own party. How will we know that you won't do it to us? And pretty much told him, these are Democrat policies. One of them was the annexation of Texas. That's why Tyler jumped on board with it, was to try to win future Democrats so he could possibly run as one. But Jackson had the whole party locked down. And they didn't do it. Jackson also really, he liked Polk. And if it came down to John Tyler or James K. Polk, who did all this fighting for him, think like George Washington and James Madison. Madison was that bulldog for Washington until Thomas Jefferson got into it, and then Madison kind of pulled back. But Madison was the bulldog, was the guy who got the votes. In fact, you know what? Change that. Remove Madison. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the guy who Washington and him really kind of had similar thoughts. He got things done, but not so much as Madison did. But yeah, Polk took over, and I don't know if they'll get to it, but I'm going to wait. But it is about Polk as the president, but I'm just going to wait because I thought it was a really cool, like, little fact.
Would be preserved, all while fulfilling America's manifest destiny. That tricky needle threaded, all Polk had to do was sit back and watch the opposition flounder. Unwilling to annex Texas, all the Whigs could do was try to portray themselves as the anti-slavery party, a hypocritical position since their nominee owned slaves. It was this simple fact that spelled Henry Clay's doom. When the election results finally came in, Polk had won the popular vote by a mere 38,000 ballots, one of the narrowest victories in US history. Painfully for the Whigs.
Sorry, if anybody didn't catch that, they were trying to put Clay into power and trying to say that this Democrat Polk owned slaves. Well, Henry Clay was from Kentucky, and he owned slaves. One person who did come up from the Henry Clay experience was Abraham Lincoln. And if you tour Lincoln's home, there is a painting in Lincoln's bedroom of Henry Clay. He idolized him. He did meet him. Henry Clay, I think, died before Lincoln was president, but Lincoln did interact with him. I don't know how much, though. I want to say Lincoln's wife, her family might have been friends with Clay, but don't quote me on that one.
Clay lost just enough votes in New York to the hardcore anti-slavery Liberal Party to put Polk over the top. Had Clay won the state, it'd have squeaked an electoral college victory. Aged just 49, Polk was set to become America's then youngest president. In doing so, he set the entire nation on a collision course with destiny. So, back in the intro, we mentioned how Polk entered the White House with 4 specific promises. So, well, now might be a good time to get them on our checklist for ticking off later. The first 2 you're already familiar with. 1, annex Texas. 2, take over the Oregon Territory. The other 2 were a little bit more obscure. 3.
The Oregon Territory, by the way, was controlled by The British for sure. And I think the Russians were up there, but the British for sure. Absolutely for sure, British. Russians, I want to say yes, but I could be wrong, which wouldn't be a first.
Lower tariff rates, and 4. Establish an independent US Treasury. Short as this list was, it was also a tall order, especially since Polk had already said he only wanted to serve one term. If he wanted to become America's most successful president, Polk was going to have to act fast.
So, the one-term issue. Washington had 2. Washington had 2. John Adams had 1. Then Jefferson at 3, Madison at 4, Monroe at 5, all had double terms. John Quincy Adams had 1. There was Andrew Jackson had 2. So you're talking in the first 7 presidents, 5 have double terms or 2 terms, and then the 2 Adams had single terms. There was this thought, Henry Clay was a part of it, and there were other politicians at the time who started saying the double terms are kind of too much. Sorry. Right on. Okay. Had an itch just right in the middle of my back. They said that it was too much. The 2 terms was too long of a time. And so what they wanted to do was start pledging to nominate people who will do 1 term. You agree to 1 term. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to have a lot of people be able to have an influence. And again, you have to think of Henry Clay, who's he's wanting to be president, preferably 2 terms, but he would take a single term. So what they were trying to do was open up this singular term. Martin Van Buren only had 1 term because he didn't do a great job. He gets a lot of flack for the Indian Removal Act, which Jackson started, but under his watch, it had to go. It had to start, or however you want to phrase it. Then with he's 8. 9 is William Henry Harrison, who dies in office, and then you got Tyler at 10. 11, you have Polk, who did the 1 term. Zachary Taylor, who I don't know if he pledged for 1 term or not. Sorry, my phone. I don't know if he pledged for 1 term, but regardless, he died 18 months in. Millard Fillmore filled out the rest. It's Millard Fillmore. He's 13. And then you had 1 term at 14. Where are you? Franklin Pierce. And then 1 term, James Buchanan. So you had a bunch of people kind of in 1 terms. Most of them, 1 term was well enough. But there was this thought process, let's just do 1 term so more people can get in and we can all just kind of have our shares and our inputs. It's a good idea in a principle, but at the same time, it's why are we compromising so that we can, you know what I mean? Like it seems weird to make this compromise to me. But that was why there was a lot of singular term presidents, is because there was this push. Henry Clay, I don't know if he led the charge, but he certainly was one of the voices where, hey, look, because instead of having 8 years of one party dominance at presidency, let's have different parties that come in and we all help, the people. Okay. It's like I say, it's a good thought in principle, but you're also expecting that the House and the Senate are going to be your party. And if they're not, they're going to stop every bit of legislation that you try to pass.
Luckily, where one item was concerned at least, Congress was already raring to go. One of the very first things Polk did in office was to sign off on Congress's joint resolution to annex Texas. That paved the way for the Lone Star State to join the Union in December 1845, providing Polk with an early win. The 11th president then immediately turned his attention to the other chunk of territory that he wanted, Oregon. Back in 1818, the US and Britain had agreed to jointly occupy Oregon country, modern-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. This had worked well for a couple of decades, but as more and more Americans started flooding in on the Oregon Trail and Manifest Destiny slowly became a thing, people began to wonder, well, why? Why were they sharing this prime piece of real estate with a bunch of limey douchebags when they could just take it for themselves? A movement even sprang up to annex the territory all the way up to what was then Russian Alaska's southern border at the latitude of 54 degrees, 14 minutes, spawning the
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of, why Russia's involved.
jingoistic slogan, 54-40 or fight. In his campaign, Polk had capitalized on this feeling, promising to take Oregon territory within a year of being elected. But now he was actually president, that whole or fight bit was starting to look a bit drastic. No one wanted a bunch of redcoats marching down from Canada and setting the White House on fire again, especially not when Mexico was clearly gearing up for a war over Texas. So Polk did the only thing he could. He got a deal. Dropping the whole 54 degrees thing, American negotiators contacted the British, wondering if they might not accept a slightly less offensive border. With the British also super not into the idea of turning the War of 1812 into an ongoing franchise, a deal was quickly reached. Oregon country would be divided along the 49th parallel, with a slight deviation at the end to allow the whole of Vancouver Island to remain in Canada. And that's how, without a shot being fired, the modern Pacific Northwest joined the USA. The Oregon Treaty came into force on June 15, 1846, less than a year and a half into his term, and Polk had already fulfilled his second campaign promise. Well, actually, he'd fulfilled all four. The first half of 1846 also saw Polk first convince Congress to lower tariffs and then to establish an independent treasury, his other two major pledges. But while the president's program was technically complete, he didn't have time to celebrate. By the time the Oregon Treaty was being signed, the Texas issue had already come to a head. The United States and Mexico were now at war. By the time the carnage ended, the political map of North America would have changed forever. In late April 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande, determined to deal with the invaders in their nation's north. It was now a few months since Texas had joined the US, an act Mexico's leaders felt should have led to war, but didn't. But letting Texas go was one thing. It was quite another to let enemies occupy Mexican soil. At last, the Mexican troops found the American intruders, and opening fire, they killed 12 before retreating. As they slipped back across the river, the soldiers must have felt a sense of triumph. Americans had occupied their soil and paid the price. But that wasn't how the Americans saw it. As far as they were concerned, Mexico had just invaded Texas. At the moment Texas became part of the USA, it had a disputed border with Mexico, an area between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River that both sides claimed as their own. Not long after Texas was annexed, Polk had sent a special envoy to Mexico City to settle the border claim. But he'd also ordered troops into the disputed zone under General Zachary Taylor. For some, this act is final proof that Polk deliberately wanted to provoke a conflict. If that's the case, well, he got his wish. 2 weeks after the ambush that killed 12 US troops, Congress authorized war with Mexico. It was the beginning of the Mexican-American War, but it was no longer just about Texas, if it ever had been. Under the guise of conflict, Polk was about to push through one of the biggest expansions that the US would ever experience. Back in 1845, Polk had dispatched Charles Fremont west to survey some land around Mexican-owned Alta California. Survey in air quotes there because Fremont was really heading an invasion force. Come May 1846, that force was lying low on the edge of Mexican territory, steadfastly being brutally murderous dicks to the local Native Americans when word arrived of their April ambush. Without even waiting to confirm if Congress had declared war, Fremont led his small force into California, rallying white settlers to his side as they marched. By June the 14th, the tiny Mexican garrison protecting the entire departamento had surrendered. Just a few weeks later, the Navy appeared off the coast and declared California U.S. territory. It would take another month or so to iron out the details, but America was at last beginning to stretch from sea to shining sea. You can see here why some people think Polk was a tricky son of a bitch. He 100% knew about Fremont's planned invasion, and it's extremely likely that he triggered the war as a cover for it. Yet, who can argue with the results. Between December of 1845 and July of 1846, the 11th president added not just Texas and Oregon Territory to America's portfolio, but also California. And there was still more to come. Over the next year and a half, Mexico was comprehensively defeated, the disputed Texas territory occupied, its capital attacked, and its government overthrown. If we ever get around to launching a War of Graphics channel, and spoiler alert, that totally might be happening, we'd love to talk you through all of the highlights, from Winfield Scott's march from Veracruz to Santa Anna's hilarious and predictable double-crossing of, well, everybody. For today's story, though, you only really need to know the outcome. Major history spoiler, though. Mexico lost. In Washington, the jingoism unleashed by Mexico's defeat was so great that some Democrats called for Polk to annex the entire country.
Serenity now!
The president managed to deflect their demands, but not by much. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo exceeded even the warmonger's wildest expectations. Not only did it set Texas's border at the Rio Grande and organize a payment to Mexico in exchange for California, it also contained provisions for the U.S. to take New Mexico. Known as the Mexican Cession, it increased the size of the USA by 1/4, giving Washington the modern states of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and California, plus bits of Wyoming and Colorado. For Polk, the treaty was its ultimate triumph. It was now nearly 4 years since it assumed the presidency, 4 years in which it fulfilled all his pledges and turned manifest destiny into concrete reality. Sure, it had taken 63,000 dead in a nasty war. Sure, it had cleared the way for a wave of indigenous killings across newly acquired California, one that would grow so vast it's today considered a genocide. But from the president's perspective, it had been worth it. America's future was now secure. Sadly, the same couldn't be said for Polk's. When Polk fulfilled his promise in 1848 to step aside after one term, it must have seemed like he'd go down in history as one of the greatest presidents. For a while he did. After all, he'd grown the country and won a war. So, why isn't that the case anymore? Why did the last survey of presidential historians in 2021 place him 18th on par with Bill Clinton? For that, you can blame the massive Pandora's box that Polk opened with his drive west. The one that ruined every president's reputation in his era. The box marked slavery. There's no point sugarcoating it. James Polk owned dozens of slaves. While he'd request that they be freed in his will, he never had the moral courage to do it himself. Of course, Polk wasn't alone in this. Half of Congress in this era consisted of slavers. And therein lay the biggest problem. As Polk drove America west, both pro- and anti-slavery advocates began to wonder if this wasn't all a scheme to bring in new slave states and shut the abolitionists out of power. As early as 1846, fights were erupting in Congress over the new states, with bills alternately banning and expanding the South's peculiar, appalling institution. Caught between competing currents in his own party and his own unsteady beliefs, Polk tried weak compromises, suggesting the Missouri Compromise line be extended clear to the Pacific. But such dithering made nobody happy. By 1848, slavery had become the defining issue of the era. By paving the way for a host of new states without settling the slavery question, Polk helped push his nation a step closer to the coming abyss. While it would take a string of failed presidents to lead it over the edge, there's no denying that Polk's failure to address this explosive issue undermines his claim to greatness. Still, as Polk left office, he could look back on 4 transformative years. Beyond his fulfilled promises, there was the creation of the Department of the Interior, the treaty signed with New Granada, modern-day Colombia, giving the U.S. right-of-way across Panama, the first step towards the eventual creation of the Panama Canal. He'd overseen Iowa and Wisconsin joining the Union, stabilized the economy, averted war with Britain, all heady, important stuff. Sure, he had to watch as the Whig Party under Zachary Taylor won the 1848 election, but still, for a one-term wonder, he was unequaled. Sadly, Polk didn't get to rest on his laurels for long. Ill from overwork when he stepped down, Polk embarked on a vacation, a tour of the South, to bask in the public's affection. While in New Orleans, the newly retired president fell deathly ill, most likely the result of a cholera outbreak then gripping the city. Thinking it was just a flare-up of his lifelong problems, Polk cut his journey short and returned to Nashville. There he died on June 15, 1849, after the shortest retirement in presidential history. Fast forward to today, and Polk occupies a weird space in the popular imagination, generally beloved by those who know of him, almost invisible to everyone else. Certainly there's a lot to love. How many other presidents have willingly stood down after a single term? How many others have entered the Oval Office with such clear goals and achieved all of them. Yet, for his personal integrity and intelligence, James K. Polk maybe falls short of being great. Too let down by the slavery issue, by the later calamities he indirectly helped cause. Great or not, though, Polk was a visionary. If you live in one of the 13 odd states he brought into the US, you're still living that vision today. Because, make no mistake, Polk was massively consequential. Whether we love him or we loathe him, we should all at least agree to remember him. So I really hope you found that video in.
So, excuse me. So they didn't cover it. Polk's wife was a murderer. No, I'm kidding. Polk's wife. Just joking. Polk's wife, as they were talking about her, she's very outgoing. People loved her. He was difficult to be around. He was. If you didn't want to talk politics, you didn't have a conversation with him. He was very difficult to just get along with because he had a singular focused mind. And when he would enter a room, he wasn't a big guy. He would enter a room and he would just kind of right on the wall and there would be times when he would just watch people. He didn't want to talk to anybody. He would just watch other people interact. And all he would think of in his mind was politics. So his wife, that drove her crazy, that people didn't want to talk to him. So she decided, I'm going to make people respect you. And so every time he entered a room, Hail to the Chief was played. When, as she would say, when my husband comes into the room, my husband's the president. People need to respect that. So when he would enter a room, Hail to the Chief would play. At first, people would look around like, what's this? And then they would see him coming in. And she would make sure she was with him as he came into the room, and she would be waving at everyone. And she was like, it's the president. And everyone was like, oh, hey, how you doing, James? And after a while, she disappeared from that. And it was played when he entered. And he would just kind of, smile and nod at people. And they would, hey, it's the president. Hey, how are you, bud? Instead of, oh, look, it's James. It's President James standing over there in the corner. Not talking to anyone. Looking like he's not enjoying his time. So it made people, hey, and it made people interact with him. So she's the one who started, when a president enters the room, Hail to the Chief, to show respect for the office and the presidency. And I thought that was pretty cool. You probably don't care about that. I thought it was cool. They taught me that when I went to the ancestral home. All right. Well, I'm going to end it here. I hope you enjoyed. I love talking presidents. So until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.